A juice box burst across Ethan's shirt just as the stranger in silk heels stopped beside his row. Gate C-17 hummed with delayed flight irritation, phones buzzing, coffee grinders hissing, rolling suitcases rattling over the ribbed floor. Ethan barely looked up. He had one hand on a paper napkin, one knee braced against a diaper bag, and his daughter half curled into his side with sleepy tears clinging to her lashes. "It's okay, Rosie. It's just sticky," he murmured, peeling the crushed carton from her small fist while the sharp smell of apple juice soaked into his denim. A businessman 2 seats away exhaled loudly and muttered something about people bringing toddlers on evening flights. Ethan said nothing. He only reached for a spare t-shirt from the overstuffed backpack at his feet, the zipper teeth catching under his thumb, and started wiping down Rosie's pink sneakers before he worried about his own shirt. That was when the woman in the charcoal coat tilted her head and asked, soft enough to cut through the airport noise, "Can I sit with you?" He glanced up then, surprised less by the question than by the way she asked it, without pity, without that careful smile strangers used around struggling parents. She held a leather tote in one hand, her boarding pass in the other, and the overhead lights flashed clean white over the silver clasp at her wrist. Ethan looked at the empty seat beside him, then at Rosie, who had gone quiet in the way children do when they decide whether an adult feels safe. "You don't have to," he said. "I know." The woman smiled once, small and tired, and sat anyway. She set her tote beneath the seat with deliberate care, as if expensive things had spent enough time being protected. Ethan went back to work. He changed Rosie's shirt behind the shield of his jacket, tied back the little girl's loose curls with a strawberry-patterned band, and traded the burst juice box for a packet of crackers from a side pocket that looked organized by instinct instead of leisure. When Rosie dropped one, he picked it up before it could be crushed under passing shoes. When she frowned at the loudspeaker crackling overhead, he tapped a plastic spoon against the armrest in a silly rhythm until she copied him and forgot to cry. The woman watched all of it without interrupting. A faint citrus perfume lingered near her collar, clean and cool against the burnt coffee air of the gate. There was a wedding band on no finger, but there was a pale line on her left hand where one had once lived. "You travel a lot?" she asked. "Only when life leaves him no choice," an older woman across the aisle said before Ethan could answer, nodding toward the pile of pediatric papers poking from his folder. Ethan gave a polite half-smile and slid the papers deeper into the folder. "We're heading home," he said simply. Rosie leaned against him, cheek pressed to the damp cotton of his shirt. The stranger noticed the way his palm covered almost the whole back of the child's head, steady and unhurried, and the way he kept scanning her face between every answer, every announcement, every passing delay. Not anxious, practiced, like a man who had learned to live in half seconds. "She's beautiful," the woman said. "She knows it," Ethan replied, and for the first time a little warmth touched his mouth. Rosie held up a cracker toward the stranger with solemn generosity. The woman accepted it like an offering. Her knuckles trembled once. Then she looked down at the medical bracelet sliding loose against Rosie's tiny wrist, and her breath caught. A hospital code was printed beneath the child's name, so it was a blood marker she knew by heart. She went still, eyes fixed on that bracelet, as if some locked room inside her had just opened in the middle of gate C-17. Boarding had not even started when Claire stood and nearly left, but Rosie's small hand caught the edge of her sleeve first. The child had fallen half asleep against Ethan's shoulder, warm and limp, one sneaker dangling above the scuffed airport tile, and Claire looked down at the tiny fingers curled into the wool of her coat, as if they had more force than the runway itself. The fluorescent lights flattened every color around them, but Rosie's bracelet still seemed too bright. Claire sat back slowly. "You can go," Ethan said, adjusting the little blanket over his daughter's knees. "She won't be offended." Claire gave a brief shake of her head. "It's all right." Her voice was even, but she reached for the paper coffee cup beside her and found it already empty. Ethan noticed the motion, unscrewed a bottle of water from his backpack, and held it out without asking questions. The plastic was cool with condensation. Claire accepted it with both hands. Across the gate, a TV mounted above the bar flashed weather maps and market numbers, but Claire's attention kept returning to the child's wrist, then to Ethan's face, then away again before he could catch the pattern. The boarding announcement finally crackled overhead. People surged up in loose, impatient lines, jackets brushing, carry-ons knocking against knees. Ethan waited. He always waited. He let the aisle clear, eased Rosie upright, then crouched to zip her little cardigan while she blinked herself awake. "Up we go, Bug," he said. Claire watched him hand the gate agent a boarding pass with one corner bent soft from being folded too many times. No assistant. No priority lane. No one carrying the weight for him. On the plane, by chance or something that felt less accidental than chance, Claire ended up across the aisle from them. Cabin air spilled cold from the vents, scented with coffee grounds and industrial cleaner. Rosie pressed her face to the oval window, fogging the glass with little bursts of breath, while Ethan wrestled a stuffed rabbit, a tablet, headphones, wipes, and a prescription bottle into the seat pocket with the efficiency of a medic packing a field kit. Claire had seen men perform confidence in boardrooms. She had seen donors perform kindness at galas. This was different. This was muscle memory built in the dark, with no applause. When turbulence hit during taxi, Rosie stiffened. Ethan didn't offer grand reassurances. He slid his hand over hers, tapped the same silly spoon rhythm against the armrest, and counted softly with her until the shudder passed. Claire turned toward the window, so neither of them would see her close her eyes. Mid-flight, when the cabin dimmed to a midnight blue and the engines settled into their deep metallic hush, Rosie stirred and pushed back her sleeve while reaching for her rabbit. The bracelet showed again. Claire leaned forward before she could stop herself. "What hospital is that from?" The question came out too quickly. Ethan looked up from the coloring book in his lap. A pause stretched between the rows, thin and sharp. "St. Matthew's Children's," he said. "Why?" Claire's fingers tightened around the capped bottle until the plastic creaked. "No reason." Ethan held her gaze a second longer than before. Not hostile. Measuring. Rosie, unaware, pointed to the rabbit's missing button eye and declared that Mr. Waffles needed surgery too. Ethan smiled and fixed the rabbit with a napkin ring from the drink cart, turning crisis into play in less than 10 seconds. Claire watched the improvisation, then looked again at the child's bracelet and finally at the folder sticking out of Ethan's bag. His last name was printed there in black block letters. Ethan Cole. The cabin seemed to narrow around her. She knew that name. Not from business. Not from charity. From a sealed file, years old, buried under legal walls, and one private gratitude she had never been able to repay. When the plane touched down and passengers reached for their bags, Claire remained seated until Ethan stepped into the aisle with Rosie on one hip. Then she rose, smoothed the front of her coat, and made a decision that changed the shape of the night. "Mr. Cole," she said, voice steady now, "if you'll allow it, I'd like to have my car take you and your daughter into the city." Cold air rolled through the jet bridge each time the terminal door opened, carrying the smell of coffee, floor polish, and rain that had followed the plane across state lines. Wheels rattled over the metal seams beneath tired passengers, and somewhere ahead a child laughed, while an overhead speaker crackled through another delayed arrival announcement. Ethan shifted Rosie higher on his hip and turned toward Claire with the cautious courtesy of a man who had spent too many years measuring every offer against its hidden cost. Rosie's cheek rested against his shoulder, warm and flushed from the flight, her small hospital bracelet peeking from the sleeve of her sweater. Claire stood beside them with one hand on the strap of her leather bag, the other lifted just slightly, not pushing, not insisting. "It's late," she said. "The roads are slick, and my driver is already downstairs. He can take you both anywhere you need to go." Ethan glanced toward the crowd moving past in gray coats and airport light, then down at Rosie's half-closed eyes. "That's generous," he said, his voice low, "but we're fine with a cab." Rosie stirred at the word and whispered, "Daddy, I'm tired." The words landed softly, but they changed the math. Ethan looked back at Claire. The bright gate lights caught the silver edge of her watch and the stillness in her face. She did not fill the silence with more persuasion. She only nodded once, as if leaving dignity a place to stand. "One ride," he said at last. "To Midtown." In the garage, the air smelled of gasoline and wet concrete. A black sedan waited beneath white fluorescent lights, its paint beaded with rain. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door, but Claire did something Ethan did not expect. She moved to the other side and held the seat, so Rosie could climb in without bumping her knees, then folded the child's blanket around her legs with careful hands that did not seem practiced, only deliberate. During the drive, the city slid past in blurred ribbons of red brake lights and storefront neon. Rosie drifted in and out, her head against the window, while Ethan kept one hand over her small sneaker like an anchor. Claire sat across from them, the faint scent of cedar and clean linen following whenever the car turned. "St. Matthew's?" she asked lightly, eyes on the bracelet for only a second. Ethan's fingers closed over it. "That's where she's seen." "Good hospital," Claire said. "It saved someone I knew." He gave a small nod and let the sentence end there. When the sedan pulled up outside a brick apartment building with a flickering vestibule light and a crooked brass number, Ethan's expression changed by less than an inch. But he noticed how quickly Claire took in the cracked step, the second-floor window with the paper star taped inside, the used car seat by the entrance. She noticed that he noticed. "Thank you," he said, opening the door before the driver could. Rain tapped against the roof in a steady hush. Claire stepped out too. "Mr. Cole," she said. The name made him pause. On the flight she had not used it. "I'm glad you let me help tonight." He studied her now, not as a stranger being kind, but as a woman who had stored away details she had no reason to keep. "How do you know my last name?" he asked. The elevator in the lobby groaned somewhere above them. Rosie shifted against his shoulder. Claire did not flinch, but she did not answer quickly enough for comfort. Then a phone buzzed inside her coat. One glance at the screen changed the air around her. Ethan caught only 3 words before she silenced it. "Board meeting." "Now." He followed her to the curb with Rosie in his arms and watched the driver pull open the front door for her like that single message had just rearranged the night. Claire met his eyes through the rain-streaked light and made a choice she could not take back. "If you need anything for your daughter," she said, hand tightening around her phone, "come to Halstead Biotech in the morning. Ask for Claire Bennett." Glass doors whispered open and shut under the pale morning sun, spilling conditioned air scented with citrus cleaner and roasted espresso into a lobby built of stone, chrome, and silence. Elevators chimed in soft intervals, heels clicked across polished floors, and the large digital logo of Halstead Biotech glowed blue above the reception desk like a thing that never slept. Ethan arrived with Rosie's paperwork tucked in a worn folder beneath his arm and a pharmacy bag crinkling in his hand, dressed in yesterday's jacket because there had been no time to think about appearances before the insurance deadline hit. Rosie was not with him this time. She was with a neighbor upstairs, fever watched, medicine measured, while he came to fight a battle that usually happened under fluorescent lights and behind hold music. The receptionist looked up with professional brightness. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Ethan said. "Claire Bennett asked me to come if I needed help." The woman's fingers stopped above the keyboard for half a breath. Then her posture straightened in a way that had nothing to do with manners and everything to do with hierarchy. "One moment, Mr. Cole." He noticed that too. A badge-locked glass door released with a soft click before he finished signing in. An assistant in a charcoal suit crossed the lobby toward him and offered a hand. "Mr. Cole, this way." The upper floor was colder than the lobby, the air carrying a faint metallic note from machines hidden behind sealed corridors. Through one wall of glass, he caught glimpses of white coats, moving monitors, and people speaking in the quiet urgency of expensive science. Then the assistant opened a conference room and stepped back. Claire stood at the far end beside a long table, city light behind her, a silver carafe steaming at her elbow, and 3 executives frozen mid-discussion as if someone had paused a film. She dismissed the room with 2 calm sentences. No raised voice, no explanation. Just power, clean and immediate. When the door shut, the silence between them changed shape. Ethan set the folder down but kept his hand on it. "You didn't mention you were the Claire Bennett," he said. "You didn't ask," she replied, then softened the edge with a glance at the folder. "What does Rosie need?" He slid the papers across. Denial notices. Coverage appeals. Procedure codes stamped in red. Claire did not skim. She read every page, the paper whispering beneath her fingertips. "This should never have been delayed," she said. "It already was," Ethan answered. "For 6 weeks." A muscle in her jaw moved once. She picked up the phone on the table. "Get pediatric review on line 3. Now." No speech about compassion. No grand promise. Only action. 10 minutes later, Ethan sat in a chair too expensive for comfort, while Claire stood at the screen, walking a claims director through Rosie's case with such precision that the excuses on the other end began to thin out and disappear. Hospital code. Lab marker. Prescription interval. He listened, and with every detail she handled too easily, the same unease returned. This was not ordinary concern. This was knowledge that had gotten personal. When the call ended, Claire signed a temporary authorization herself, ink dark against cream paper. Coverage is reinstated for 90 days pending full review, she said, sliding the document to him. The medication can be released this afternoon. Relief passed through him only briefly. Suspicion stayed longer. Why are you doing this? He asked. Claire's fingers settled on the edge of the table, still as glass. Because your daughter shouldn't pay for bureaucracy. That's not the whole answer. Outside the window, a helicopter thudded somewhere over the river, its sound faint through the sealed panes. Claire looked at him, then at the bracelet printout clipped to Rosie's records, and almost said something that would have broken the morning open. Instead, she pressed the papers toward him. Take this to St. Matthew's Pharmacy, she said. And if anyone gives you trouble again, call me directly. Ethan gathered the authorization but left one page on the table by accident, or maybe instinct. It was a copy of Rosie's intake sheet, the hospital code visible in the corner. Claire reached for it too quickly, and both of them noticed. Ethan's hand stopped over hers. Not touching, close enough to feel the cool air between skin. You knew that code before you knew us, he said. Claire held his gaze while the room hummed with distant ventilation and city light sharpened across the glass. Then she made the move that shifted everything by one more inch. She drew a business card from her pocket, wrote a private number on the back, and placed it in his palm. Tonight, she said quietly, after you get Rosie's medication, let me explain what I can. Late sunlight lay across the conference table in pale gold bars, and the low thrum of the ventilation seemed louder now that neither of them was speaking. The card in his hand still carried the warmth of Claire's fingers, the ink on the back slightly raised under his thumb. Ethan looked at the number, then at her, then slipped the card into his wallet with the same care he used when tucking Rosie's hospital papers away from Rain. You said after medication, he told her. I'm not giving you more than 30 minutes. Claire nodded once. No smile, no practiced executive ease, just a small movement that made the diamonds at her ears catch the cold office light. 30 is enough, she said. The pharmacy sat 3 blocks away, all fluorescent glare and the sharp smell of disinfectant, and Ethan stood under the buzzing lights while the pharmacist stapled papers and slid a white bag across the counter. 90 days. Temporary. The label rustled in his hand, like something too thin to trust. Outside, the evening had turned cooler, wind sliding between the towers and carrying the smell of wet concrete from a street being washed down. He should have gone home. He knew that. Rosie would be with Mrs. Alvarez next door, probably asleep with one sock half off and a stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. But 30 minutes could become a lock or a key, and fathers learned the difference the hard way. Claire had not chosen a restaurant. She had texted an address to a quiet medical archive annex on Halstead's older campus, a limestone building tucked behind glass labs and lit by amber security lamps. When Ethan entered, the place smelled faintly of paper, coffee gone cold, and the metallic chill of overworked air conditioning. Claire was already there in a narrow records room with one banker's box on the table between them. Not a stack, not an ambush. One box. That mattered. You brought files, Ethan said. I brought the only thing that can explain why I knew that code, she answered. She did not push the box toward him. Instead, she opened it herself and drew out a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, his name printed in block letters from years ago. Ethan's shoulders tightened before his face did. Where did you get that? It was in a restricted recovery file tied to St. Matthew's and a private partnership grant, Claire said. Her voice stayed level, but her thumb pressed hard enough into the envelope corner to bend it. I wasn't supposed to access it without cause. Rosie gave me cause. He did not sit. That's not an explanation. No, she said quietly. It's the beginning of one. She slid a photocopy beside the envelope instead, choosing distance over intrusion. Across the page ran old intake numbers, a donation date, and the logo of a hospital Ethan had not stepped into in years. He stared at it while a copier hummed faintly somewhere down the hall. I was 26, he said after a moment, almost to himself. They were running a donor drive after a warehouse accident. My blood type matched. I stayed an extra hour. That's all. Claire's breath caught so softly it barely disturbed the room. Her hand moved to the file, then stopped, as if even touching paper might be too much. It wasn't all, she said. The sentence hung there with the quiet click of a motion sensor light shifting brighter overhead. Ethan looked up slowly. Claire's gaze did not move. For the first time since he had met her, the power in the room had nothing to do with her title. That donation, she said, each word placed carefully, was connected to an emergency treatment protocol I received the same week. The date, the hospital marker on Rosie's bracelet, your name in the sealed file, they all point to the same thing. Ethan's jaw worked once. You're saying you know me because of a hospital form from 8 years ago? I'm saying I think your name saved my life, Claire answered. The wind pressed lightly against the old window panes. Somewhere in the building a door shut, deep and hollow. Ethan finally pulled out the chair and sat, not because he trusted her, but because standing suddenly felt less stable than wood and steel. He looked again at the photocopy, at the blurred stamp, at the date. Not proof. Not yet. But no longer coincidence either. Claire reached into her coat pocket and set a second item beside the file. A slim silver medical bracelet, worn smooth from years of being handled, its engraved code almost identical to Rosie's. Tomorrow morning, she said, her voice lower now. Come with me to St. Matthew's records office, and I'll open everything I legally can. Rain had begun by the time the archive lights went out, a fine silver drift against the parking lot lamps, and the asphalt shone black as polished stone. Claire stood beneath the narrow awning while Ethan locked the second button on his jacket with one hand and held Rosie's medication bag under the other arm. He did not offer her shelter under his umbrella. He only paused long enough to hear her next words. 9 o'clock, she said. St. Matthew's South Records in trance. Ethan looked past her toward the blurred city lights. If this turns into another half-truth, I walk. If it does, Claire said, rain tapping softly against the metal rail beside her, you should. He left her there and drove home through wet streets and red brake lights, his knuckles pale on the steering wheel each time the old donor date came back to him. At home, the apartment was warm with leftover tomato soup and fabric softener, the kind of ordinary air that usually steadied a man. Rosie was asleep on the couch under a cartoon blanket, one hand curled around her rabbit's long ear. Mrs. Alvarez had left a note by the sink in looping blue ink. Fever down. Slept easy. Ethan touched Rosie's forehead anyway. Cool enough. He exhaled through his nose and stood there longer than he meant to, listening to the refrigerator hum and the muted hiss of rain at the window. On the table lay Claire's card, the private number facing up beside a crayon with the paper peeled back. He turned the card over once, then slid it under a coaster as if hiding it might lower its weight. Morning came gray and damp. St. Matthew's smelled of lemon cleaner, old tile, and coffee burned too long in a staff lounge somewhere down the corridor. Claire was already waiting near the records desk, not in silk and heels this time, but in a navy coat and low shoes, as though she had dressed for less distance. She had 2 visitor badges in her hand and dark circles faintly shadowing the skin beneath her eyes. Ethan noticed. He also noticed she had brought no assistants, no legal team, no protective layer of corporate glass. Just a folder pressed flat against her side. You came alone, he said. So did you, she answered. The records clerk buzzed them through after Claire signed a release form and presented identification with the quiet precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment more than once. Downstairs, the archive room was cool enough to raise gooseflesh on the forearms, rows of compact shelving stretching under white lights that clicked and blinked awake in sections. Claire set the folder on a steel table, but did not open it yet. Instead, she watched Ethan remove his damp jacket and drape it over the chair, watched the care with which he checked his phone for a message from home before silencing it. Small things, honest things, dangerous things, when a person had started wanting more than gratitude. Before we do this, she said, there's something you deserve that has nothing to do with records. Ethan stayed standing. Then say it. Claire's fingers tightened along the folder edge until her knuckles paled under the fluorescent light. The coverage wasn't charity, she said, and it wasn't strategy. I helped because I couldn't stand by after recognizing your name, and because every time I looked at Rosie, I kept thinking about what it costs one parent to hold a whole life together. Ethan's face gave almost nothing back, but the silence changed. Less guarded steel. More waiting. Claire drew a breath that shook at the end and forced herself not to look away. "I've spent years trying to find the man behind that file," she said. "Not to repay a debt with money. Not to own any piece of his life. Just to know whether I could ever stand in front of him without lying." The words settled between them with the faint rattle of air through old ducts. Ethan lowered his eyes to the folder, then to her hand still resting on it like a promise she did not trust herself to break. "And now?" he asked. Claire gave the smallest, saddest smile, the kind that arrives after too many rehearsed versions have failed. "Now I'm standing here wanting something I didn't plan for." She slid the folder toward him, but kept her fingertips on the cardboard 1 second longer than necessary. "If you want the records, open it. If you want me gone after that, I'll go." Ethan looked at the folder, then at the woman who had power enough to command whole floors, and yet was leaving the next move entirely to him. He set his palm on the file. He did not open it. Not yet. Instead, he pulled the chair out across from him and said, quietly, with rain still whispering against the basement window well, "Sit down, Claire. This time, tell the truth first." Dust floated through the cone of a humming fluorescent bulb, and somewhere beyond the archive wall a cartwheel squealed, then stopped. The room smelled of paper glue, cold metal, and rain drying on wool. Claire did not sit right away. Her fingers stayed on the back of the chair Ethan had pulled out, knuckles pale against the gray vinyl, while the sealed folder lay between them like something with its own pulse. Ethan remained standing for one breath longer, jaw set, palms still resting on the file. Then he moved back a step as if space itself were the only way he could keep the room from closing in. "You said truth first," Claire said, her voice low enough that the air return above them nearly swallowed it. "Then don't open that until I finish." He gave one short nod. No permission, no warmth, just time. She sat. The chair legs scraped the tile with a dry, brittle sound. "Years ago," she began, looking not at him but at the edge of the table, "St. Matthew's ran an emergency compatibility program when they were trying to expand an experimental treatment line. My kidneys were failing. Fast." Ethan's eyes shifted once, toward the blue hospital band still looped around his wrist from Rosie's appointments, then back to her face. Claire inhaled, and the breath shook at the end. A donor registry alert came through after a workplace blood drive across 3 partner companies. One match was unusually strong. The donor signed a broad research and emergency use release. Her fingertips touched the folder, but did not open it. That donor was Ethan Cole. The fluorescent light buzzed louder in the silence that followed. Somewhere upstairs, a door shut. Ethan did not reach for the file now. He reached for the chair instead, turned it hard, and sat with both boots planted flat on the floor. "I never gave anyone my permission to be hunted down," he said. The words were quiet, but the chair under him groaned when he leaned forward. Claire took that blow without flinching. "No one was supposed to identify you. Not legally. Not then." She swallowed. "I didn't know your name when the procedure happened. I knew a donor code, a blood type, a date, and the fact that somebody I would never meet walked into a clinic on an ordinary Tuesday and signed a form that kept me alive." Ethan's hand closed around the edge of the table. The metal lip clicked under his grip. "Then why Rosie?" Claire's gaze lifted at last. "Because 6 months ago I saw a claim denial cross my desk during a review meeting. St. Matthew's. Pediatric autoimmune coverage lapse. There was a bracelet photo attached from a transport exception request. The rain outside thickened, tapping the window while like fingertips. I recognized the code format from my old sealed file. I had them pull the legal packet. That's when I saw your name." His face hardened at once, and this time he did open the folder, not gently, but with one sharp motion that sent a few photocopied pages sliding crooked across the table. Consent forms. Redacted lab summaries. A donor entry with his signature at 30, careless and slanted from a day he clearly had not understood would echo this far. Then a second document, clipped behind it. Access logs. Claire's requests. Dates. Times. Her name over and over. Ethan looked at that page longer than the others. When he spoke, his voice had gone flatter, colder. "You didn't just help my daughter." Claire's throat tightened visibly. "No, you watched us." The word landed harder than any raised voice could have. She did not deny it. "I checked every time her claims were touched. I called legal when they stalled. I had no right to look as often as I did." Ethan stood so abruptly the chair legs bit the floor. "No, you didn't." The old radiator hissed beside the wall, filling the gap before he spoke again. You don't get to turn my child into your way of paying a debt. Claire rose too now, but slower, hands open and empty at her sides. It stopped being debt. Don't. He stepped back from the table, eyes bright with a strain he refused to name. You don't get to decide what this means for me. Not after reading through years of my life like it belonged to you. He gathered the loose pages, shoved them back into the folder, and thrust it into her hands. The paper slapped against her coat. Whatever this is, it ends here. Claire caught the file against her chest and stood utterly still, as if movement might crack the room. Ethan was already at the door when his phone began to ring. The sound sliced through the basement hum, shrill and wrong. He looked at the screen once, and all the color drained from his face. He answered before the second ring finished. Rosie. A small, frightened voice spilled tinny through the speaker, followed by coughing and a crash of something ceramic hitting a floor. Ethan was gone before Claire could speak, and when she ran after him into the cold corridor, she heard only one thing over his pounding footsteps and the alarm now rising in his breath. Stay with me, baby. I'm coming. Cold air rushed through the hospital, loading in trance each time the automatic doors parted, carrying the sharp smell of antiseptic, wet asphalt, and burnt coffee from a vending alcove nearby. A gurney rattled over a threshold somewhere down the hall. By the time Ethan reached St. Matthew's pediatric intake with Rosie in his arms, his coat was half-buttoned, her little body was too warm against his chest, and the pink ceramic dust from the shattered mug at home still clung to one sleeve. Her cough came in short, dry bursts against his neck. Claire arrived less than a minute behind him, breath visible in the blue-white lights spilling from the sliding doors, the archive file tucked under one arm, and Ethan's anger still hanging between them like a wire neither dared touch. She had a fever when I got there, Ethan said to the intake nurse, words clipped, one hand smoothing damp curls from Rosie's forehead. Her fingers locked up for a second. She couldn't catch her breath. Monitors beeped in two different rhythms from behind the triage curtain. A printer chattered. The nurse reached for the keyboard, then paused at the screen. Coverage shows temporary reinstatement ending soon. Some of her infusion authorization notes are incomplete. Ethan's jaw tightened so hard a muscle jumped near his temple. Before he could answer, Claire stepped forward and set a business card on the counter with two fingers. Run the emergency continuity protocol under Halstead Pediatric Relief Guarantee. I'll sign personal liability if needed. The nurse looked up, recognized her, and straightened immediately. Ethan turned toward Claire with disbelief and heat rising at once. No, the single word cracked out of him. Rosie stirred weakly at the sound. Claire did not look at Ethan first. She looked at Rosie's blue lips, then at the pulse ox clip being snapped onto the child's finger. This is not about winning an argument, she said. It's about getting her into a room in the next 30 seconds. The curtain rings scraped. The nurse waved them through. Inside triage, the light was too bright, flattening every tired line in Ethan's face. Rosie's sneakers dangled from the exam bed, while a respiratory therapist fitted a tiny mask near her mouth. Cool mist hissed through the tubing. Ethan stood close enough that her fingers could keep hold of his shirt. Claire stayed back by the sink at first, hands braced on the counter, watching the monitor numbers climb and dip. Then Rosie opened heavy eyes and whispered through the mask, "Plain lady?" The room fell still in that tender, strange way truth often arrives, not with thunder, but with the smallest voice. Claire stepped closer. "I'm here, sweetheart." Rosie lifted her hand. Claire took it carefully, as though even comfort had to be asked for. Ethan watched that, exhausted and cornered by a moment too human for clean anger. The attending physician entered with a tablet and glanced from Rosie to Claire to Ethan. "I've reviewed her chart," he said. "There's a note in the legacy records we need to confirm before treatment. A previous donor-linked biologic sample may explain why her reaction pattern is unusual." Ethan looked up sharply. "Donor-linked to who?" The doctor hesitated only because Claire had already gone still. The overhead vent hummed. "To an adult emergency recipient case from years ago," he said. "The sample trail intersects both of their files." Ethan turned toward Claire with the kind of silence that leaves no shelter. She reached slowly into the archive folder, pulled out one final page, and handed it not to the doctor, but to Ethan. "This is the part one should have said before anything else." His eyes moved over the line items, over the old release language. over the notation that a preserved donor-derived compatibility line from his emergency sample had later informed Rosie's own treatment mapping when St. Matthew's built her pediatric plan after infancy. The room seemed to narrow around the paper in his hand. Claire's voice came softer now, with no office polish left in it. You didn't just save me without knowing. A piece of that same decision helped doctors understand how to treat your daughter when she was born sick. I found you because your name was in both places, and I couldn't live another year pretending that was random. Ethan looked from the page to Rosie, then back to Claire, and for the first time his anger met something even heavier than betrayal. The shape of a life joined long before either of them chose it. Rosie coughed once, squeezed both their hands by accident or instinct, and the monitor steadied into a cleaner rhythm while the doctor waited beside the bed for Ethan to decide whether Claire stayed when the next treatment began. The fluorescent lights hummed with that flat hospital buzz that made every second feel longer, and the sharp smell of antiseptic sat over the room like cold steam. Beyond the curtain, a cartwheel clicked over a crack in the tile. Then the pediatric monitor answered with a steadier, softer pulse. Ethan kept one hand around Rosie's tiny fingers and looked at the page again as if the ink might rearrange itself into something easier to carry. Claire did not move closer. She stood just inside the spill of white light, coat still on, shoulders held carefully still, as though even 1 inch in the wrong direction might be mistaken for taking more than she had already taken. If you want me gone, she said, her voice low enough that Rosie only heard the gentleness in it, I'll go. But if she needs one more signature, one more call, one more fight tonight, let me do that before you decide what I deserve. Ethan lifted his eyes to her then, not quickly, not kindly, just fully. The silence between them had changed shape. It was no longer built from suspicion alone. It carried his daughter's breathing, the doctor's waiting, the weight of a choice made years ago in a donation chair under bright lights and a paper blanket, a choice he had never treated like heroism because he had never known whose life it reached. Rosie stirred against the pillow. The cotton case rasped softly beneath her cheek. Daddy, she whispered, dry-throated, is she staying? That small question did what charts and sealed files could not. It pulled everything back to the bed, to the child with hospital tape on her wrist and a stuffed rabbit tucked beneath one arm. Ethan bent and smoothed a curl from Rosie's forehead. His fingers were rough, warm, trembling only once before he stilled them. If that's okay with you, he said. Rosie gave the smallest nod, then reached out without ceremony, opening one sleepy hand toward Claire. Claire crossed the room then, not like a CEO entering a boardroom, but like a woman approaching something holy with empty hands. The vinyl chair squeaked as she sat on the other side of the bed. Rosie placed her palm over Claire's wrist for 1 second, then drifted back into the drowsy hush of medication and exhaustion. The doctor stepped forward, papers tucked under one arm. We need consent to begin the next treatment cycle now, he said. Coverage is active. The donor-linked protocol note stays in her file. We can move. Ethan straightened. The room felt too cold at his neck, too bright at his eyes. He looked at the consent form, then at Claire, then signed his name with a hard, deliberate stroke. The pen clicked shut. Something in the air clicked with it. Not forgiveness, not yet in the easy sense, but an end to running. No more sealed doors, he said. No more checking records behind my back. No more deciding for me because you're afraid of losing what you found. Claire nodded once, and the breath she took after that sounded thin and unsteady. No more, she said. I spent years thanking a ghost because it was easier than facing a man who might hate what I'd become around his kindness. I won't hide behind that again. Ethan studied her a long moment. Under the hospital light, the polish of wealth had nowhere to hide. There was only a tired woman with red-rimmed eyes and a child's handprint pressed faintly into the sleeve of her coat. He pulled the second chair closer to the bed, its metal legs scraping softly across the tile, and left it beside him. It was a small movement, quiet, almost nothing from a distance. Yet it changed the room. Claire looked at the chair, then at him. Sit, Ethan said. But this time, stay because we both choose it. Dawn had begun to silver the narrow window in the door by the time Rosie opened her eyes again and found them both there, one on each side, their hands resting near hers on the blanket like a promise finally spoken in the open. And in that pale new light, the question that had first brought them together no longer sounded like a stranger asking for space, but like the beginning of a family learning how to make room for love.